Welcome, you're watching Head to Head. I'm Antonina Antosha with UATV. Over a year ago, the Human Rights Ombudsperson and Labor Initiatives NGO presented a campaign called Solidarity Against Corruption, aiming to educate trade union members, civil society, and the broader public on the anti-corruption role of freedom of association and workplace activism. So what results have been achieved so far? To talk more about this, we welcome in our studio today Svitlana Iukhymovych. She is a communications officer at Labor Initiatives NGO. Hello and thank you for joining.
Thank you so much, Antonina. First of all, on behalf of the Labor Initiatives team, thank you for inviting me and my colleagues to speak at the studio and for Head to Head. So I would like to mention just briefly about the Solidarity Against Corruption campaign.
Always a pleasure. Tell us all about the initiative.
Sure. So we started it actually a couple of years ago, and it's a broad civil society coalition that conjoins the efforts of trade union organizations as well as civil society organizations, including Labor Initiatives and Transparency International Ukraine. And this campaign is aimed to raise awareness within the trade unions and within the general public about the protections that exist for whistleblowers at any level who intend to expose corruption through the collective means. And so we have this paradigm in Ukraine where there's a perception that corruption is an issue that exists solely within the public sphere, say within the high levels and ranks of power and government officials. But that is not entirely true, because corruption exists both in the public and the private sphere. And who, if not the workers employed at certain enterprises, would have access to information and who would see firsthand instances of corruption or embezzlement or any sort of grand theft happening? Because, as the definition of corruption suggests, it is an abuse of power, which could be translated to, could occur both at enterprises of grand scale, where some management or grand officials could be involved allegedly in some corrupt schemes, or at public institutions of power, including, say, the government. And so the campaign thus far has resulted in an issue of an online and a print manual for whistleblowers that highlights the means of protection that exist for whistleblowers and the way that one could go about exposing corruption. So,
which are? Because being aware is one thing. Tackling the problem, solving the issue is totally another thing. And you just said that you have a manual.
Yes.
What's in the manual?
So, in the manual, we highlight this particular method for the exposure of corruption and for tackling this problem, which has to do with freedom of association, collective bargaining, and primarily the right to strike. We believe that trade unions that are democratically organized, that are fair, that are representative of thousands and millions of workers, have the tools necessary to bring attention to the issues of corruption.
What if the trade union is not organized the proper way?
Well, that's the point, that trade unions within the framework of the law of Ukraine have the power to use mechanisms to protect their members from, say, illegal firing. Say, if a member of a trade union has reported an issue of corruption and then the management would like to retaliate against that member of a trade union or a worker by firing them, there are mechanisms to restore them in their position, say, that go through court and then that help that worker to avoid persecution and retaliation. Because, you know, in Ukraine, about 45% of people, according to the Transparency International reports, have seen instances of corruption, have encountered them, but only about 2% end up being whistleblowers. So, within our manual, we posit that collective means are very effective, because once workers come together, there is less chance that they will be targeted as on an individual basis. So, the more voices there are in any campaign against, a corrupt official or anyone who holds any position of power and who may allegedly go through some schemes and scams that relate to corruption, when people come together and use their right to strike and bring attention to the issue, even through the mechanisms of publicity and raising awareness about that and bringing attention of the media and anyone who might be interested in kind of exposing that further.
That's already effective?
That's already effective. And as a collective way of exposing corruption, I think it's the most effective in protecting individual members or individuals who would like to kind of serve as human rights defenders and as somebody who would be willing to put themselves and their families essentially at risk by exposing corruption. So,
do you have any personal or private stories you want to share that are the stories of success that have been achieved within the manual you have and within the initiative you've been actively working on?
Sure. So there have been several, say, success stories. One of the most notable one was with the trade union at the Hall of Official Delegations at Boryspil Airport, where the trade union actually went through the complex procedure of declaring a strike. And essentially, the strike was called demanding the restoration of workers who had been illegally fired at the Hall of Official Delegations at Boryspil, but also it brought attention to the management issues of theft of grant funds and of daily, essentially alleged embezzlement of resources. So in that particular instance, strike brought attention to the issue, and an investigation ensued, and then a court case ensued, and as a result, some portion of the embezzled funds had been restored. So,
okay. We've just clarified that corruption is a very big issue. What about gender inequality?
Oh, gender inequality. Well, let's say all of the issues within the human rights framework are deeply interconnected. So,
yes, but how bad is the problem with gender inequality in Ukraine is? Can you evaluate?
As somebody working within the sphere of protection of labor rights, I would like to talk a little bit about the inequalities that persist in the workplace in Ukraine. So right now, inequality in the workplace is a prevalent issue where, for example, women are denied access to leadership position and are set up certain barriers to equal pay. And the gender pay gap is a pervasive issue that still persists in Ukraine, depending on the industry.
How much is the pay gap? Is it 10, 12, 20% now?
So, as I said, it depends on the industry. It varies from up to 20% to 36% and up.
36, that's almost a half, that's a lot.
So, for example, for every 200 hryvnias that a man in Ukraine earns, a woman would earn 148 hryvnias. So, as you can tell, that's a huge gap, that's a huge difference. And mind it, we are talking about, say, two hypothetical individuals, a man and a woman, who have had equivalent level of experience, say, similar degrees, similar experience in the same field, and still they would get this much of a difference within their paycheck, and that translates then to further limited opportunities for women that persist in, say, advancement of the career ladder. There's a phenomenon called the glass ceiling, and then the phenomenon called the sticky floor. The sticky floor phenomenon means that, like, it's more difficult for women
to get up.
To get up, yeah, essentially, they get stuck in a certain level of work, and then men technically have a higher probability to advance up the career ladder faster. And as for the leadership representation, women in leadership positions representation, there's still a bit of a problem. Within the recent report published by the UNFPA and the United Nations, there's evidence that women still are very much so underrepresented in leadership positions. Say, within the parliament, there's only 12% of members of the parliament who are women. Within the trade unions, that indicator is slightly better. Slightly better. Well, that's why I'm an advocate of the trade union movement and of workers uniting for defense of their rights. So within the trade unions, right now, the majority of chairs of trade unions and local trade union organizations are women. So that's a good dynamic. But this is an exception rather than the rule. You know, generally, there's still ways to go for Ukraine in terms of changing certain stereotypes about the opportunities for women.
How would change the situation?
Well, I think that The first step to changing the situation is changing the perceptions and the cultural stereotypes about women's role, and then backing that up with actual policies and quotas, say even within the structures like the parliament and within certain companies. The installment of quotas has been a great method to raise women up and give them opportunities for leadership. But then I would like to mention one unique way that women can take their power and use it and actually fight to obtain better circumstances for themselves. And I would like to bring an example of Iceland. We all know that Iceland is a well-known country for its equality index. It's like on the top. I think it's one of the top spots in all the rankings in terms of gender equality. It still has an observable pay gap, but it's like very slight, several % between women and men, which is still very good. And why has that happened? Well, in 1975, women in Iceland decided to unite and hold a nationwide strike. So during that strike in 1975, I believe it was around spring or summertime, women decided to go through the procedure of declaring a strike, legally warn their bosses that, hey, we will not be
throughout the whole country.
Yeah, throughout the whole country. Hey, we will not be going to work tomorrow, and so be prepared. Our husbands will go to work with our kids, and they refused to do any housework. They refused to go to work. Instead, they gathered in main squares of the country, and guess what? The entire country just stopped functioning. All of the enterprises were forced to close. All of the transportation industries were forced to shut down. All of the publications were closed. So that sent a message to men and women in Iceland, stating the importance of women in all processes and the need for a tangible monetary reward for women for their work, both at home and within the workplace. So that's kind of a method that I'm all for and that I would like to advocate for, is that...
So are you calling for an all-Ukrainian national women's strike?
I mean, that would be amazing. I'm a strong believer that whenever rights are not given to a certain segment of a population or, certain people or us, it is within our power and within our responsibility to take those rights back, because they're not going to be just given back to us. So, and that's the message that we try to send within the Solidarity Against Corruption campaign, within our On Equality in the Workplace coalition, within the solidarity platforms that we hold, is that as long as people unite and then take concrete steps to take back their rights, there are tangible results.
What kind of events does your organization usually hold to educate people, to make them aware?
So we have both weekly and monthly events, and say movie nights, lectures. We hold a once a year opportunity for trade union activists and for local activists to come together in one place for a massive educational event that is the Summer Trade Union School for young activists.
How young are we talking about? What is the age restriction?
Since we're talking about primarily people who are engaged in activism within the labor sphere, it would be 21 years of age and older. So those are people who perhaps are students or have just graduated and entered the workforce, or have gone through several years of work at their workplace and have showed themselves to be active leaders locally already in some capacity. So the summer school is a great platform for them to come together in solidarity and learn from one another. It's a great way to foster connections and network, and use it as a platform for sort of civil society startups almost, where people would find like-minded individuals and then connect with them and try to come up with, say, new initiatives. And it's a great platform for communication between trade union activists and civil society activists, and a great platform for dialogue dialogue between the various trade unions that exist in Ukraine on the level of their youth committees. So, and there are various topics that we explore within the trade union school. We talk about, well, say, the issues of the gender pay gap and tolerance and inclusion, and the issues of economic inequality, and then we have a whole block about popular economics, and we talk about how social change can be fostered within, through the agency of individuals represented there, and how collective means of protection could be used for their trade unions. So.
It's very interesting. You've mentioned that this event is an annual one.
Yes.
It's being held once a year. You've also mentioned that you have weekly and monthly events. Dwell on that.
Sure. So it depends kind of on the scope and the intention of where we want to go with the event. So, for example, in March we held actually an interesting series of weekly lectures and events that had to do with the issue of inequality. And so we talked about the issue of gender-based violence. We talked more broadly about the context of the struggle for equality in Ukraine and in other countries. And then we had kind of like a culminating final lecture where we happened to have some international guests. So it was about contextualizing the battle for equality in an international context. So that was one of our more popular events. And then we actually happened to have a talk with women working in professions where they are usually underrepresented. So we had a woman diver, a woman working at an underground mine, a member of a parliament who was a woman, who were talking about their experiences trying to obtain work in positions that are usually precluded for women. Yeah. And it was contextualized within the framework of the recent cancellation of an order that listed nearly 450 professions that were forbidden for women. We no longer have that order, but the barriers still persist in one way or another, at least economically. And so that conversation was meant to give those women who have gone through the difficult process of trying to work where they wanted to work, to just give them a chance to tell their stories.
Well, hopefully in future those barriers will be erased completely. Thank you for what you're doing. You're doing a wonderful job, and thank you so much for coming.
Sure. Thank you so much.
That was Svitlana Iukhymovych. She is the Communications Officer at Labor Initiatives NGO. Thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned with UATV for the rest.